and welcome to today's event on accelerating Europe's heating transition. I am Emmeline Speer. I'm Director for Europe at Agora Energiewende, and I'm delighted to welcome you and to see both industry, policymakers, and civil society in the room. Your presence is a testament to the growing urgency of today's topic. A couple of announcements to start with. Today we are gathering you here, but we are also officially launching our new report, Boosting the Clean Heat Market, which is now available online since this morning. This report makes the case for accelerating Europe's heating transition and explores whether a clean heat market instrument, inspired by the UK, could, at EU level, help overcome key market barriers and improve the effectiveness and fairness of the existing set of policy measures. In addition to the main report, we're also publishing three studies that were the foundation for this report and that were prepared by our external partner, LCP Delta, that is a specialized consultancy with deep expertise in the heating market. These studies provide detailed insights into, one, the current state of play of the European heating market, two, important design considerations for an EU clean heat market instrument, and three, the possible impacts of introducing such an instrument. We encourage you, of course, to look at those reports, and they are the foundation for the presentations and discussion today. So why does it matter to be here today to talk about heating? Like is often said, like we often say for European industry, also the heating sector is at a crossroads. Clean heat is essential in meeting Europe's climate and energy goal, and the Fit for 55 package set ambitious target. However, by and large, we continue to rely on fossil fuel heating, and heat pump sales are basically back to their pre-crisis levels, meaning that we're not yet on track. And meanwhile, we know that like in other sectors, major industrial changes lie ahead, major regulatory changes lie ahead, and the upcoming Electrification Action Plan and the Clean Industrial Deal will be also key to the next phase of policy making. So it's time to ask the question, how can we create the right market conditions to accelerate the transition in a way that is fair and that is predictable? So this is where we come in. At Agora, we believe in effective policy design. And that's why we've been working to assess whether this idea of a clean heat market instrument could help unlock investments, support the industry transition, and most of all, make clean heating more accessible to consumers. So what to expect for today? This event is structured to provide clear and evidence-based insights from multiple perspectives. There will be a kind of a rhythm in principle. We'll begin with a market deep dive to understand the current challenges. We'll then learn from the UK's experience in implementing a clean heat market mechanism. And finally, we'll present Agora's proposal for an EU clean heat market instrument before opening up the discussion with our panel. So we hope that this event fosters a constructive dialogue, like I must say we have had all across the preparation of this report with many stakeholders, including the industry, and that it moves us closer to effective solutions. With that, let's begin by hearing more about the background and the motivation for the project, and I hand over to Andreas Graf.
Thank you very much. We're also being boosted by some music in the background, so hopefully the online participants are not also privy to that. So my name is Andreas Graf, and I'm Program Lead for EU Climate and Energy Policy at Agora Energiewende, and I've been leading this project over the last year or so. The clicker. We do not have a clicker in the front for the presentation. Sorry. Oh, it's My apologies. And as Emelina said, today we release our contribution to a broader debate. And one of the important things we want to kick off with at this event is to set the scene for why we did this in the first place. And important to understand for this debate that we believe the heating transition at a very pivotal moment, at an inflection, actually. That inflection has already been made clear in markets for heat pumps over the last years. On the one hand, we had an upward inflection during the energy crisis, where heat pump sales accelerated and increased very significantly. But over the last year, we've also seen that market recede back into pre-crisis level sales. So there has been, in a period where we should see a rapid acceleration of clean heating deployment to meet our climate energy goals, we've seen rather a deceleration and a significant decline. We also currently have a heating market that is dominated by fossil fuel boilers. That should be no surprise. It wouldn't be called a heating transition if we didn't have a place to start with that needed to be transitioned away from. But the market is still truly dominated by fossil fuel boilers, and I think it's important to underline that. Based on LCP Delta's work, we have here an overview across key heating markets in Europe for the sales of hydronic central heating appliances over the last year. And fossil fuel boilers dominate the EU level sales at the moment, making up close to 80% of sales in this market segment. Worryingly as well, however, this is true across Europe, with no major heating market not having a majority share of fossil heating in its current sales mix. Looking forward, it's also not looking promising that this will be corrected anytime soon. On the one hand, we know from the current market sales that the current policy and market framework is insufficient to drive a radical turnaround of clean heating. But looking forward, there are also some warning signs as to whether that can be reversed anytime soon. On the one hand, we're increasingly seeing countries struggle to increase financial support for clean heating, in some cases even cutting it dramatically, in cases such as Austria, where support has lapsed at the end of last budget year. And many other countries, a current climate of fiscal consolidation is also leading to conversations as to what scale we can have clean heating support. At the same time, a big policy signal that came out of the Fit for 55 package, a new emissions trading system for heating and transport fuels, is, let's say, a very important driver potentially of clean heating uptake in the future, but one that will also face some political headwinds in the coming years. Already today, well before its introduction in 2027, we are seeing political voices come up to say, slow down, and at least make sure that the carbon price signal that such a system sends is not overwhelming citizens. So when looking at the picture here that this image shows us to what carbon prices would be needed for that carbon price signal alone to correct, let's say, the market imbalance, we cannot necessarily expect the ETS2 on its own to deliver this market turnaround. Other efforts to send a clear signal to the market via strong regulations, including real or de facto bans on standalone fossil fuel boilers, have also seen big setbacks over the last years. In 2023, in the heart of the energy crisis, there was a conversation across Europe, these countries in particular, about what to do about fossil fuel boilers in a period of dramatic fossil fuel dependency. And numerous proposals were made as to how to restrict fossil fuel sales into the future. Starting with a very heated discussion in Germany in the spring of 2023. Most of those conversations have not led to a legislative outcome that has strengthened the regulatory framework. And currently, it is also not looking like such a regulatory restriction as a ban is anywhere close to having political support. So in that context, we believe, and LCP Delta's market forecast for our project shows, that fossil gas boilers are set to remain the dominant fossil fuel heating technology, not just in the next couple of years, but over the next decade and potentially well beyond. So their market forecast, and Stephen Ashurst from LCP Delta will go into a deeper dive as to the market conditions today. Forecasts that fossil fuel boilers will even have sales of, or a market share of 41% up to 2040. Now, we believe that this picture, this stalling heating transition, puts the EU's climate and energy targets and goals at risk, but also increasingly is undermining the competitiveness of the EU heating industry. Now, I would like to just run through those risks that we see on the market due to these market conditions to set the scene. First, the EU is perhaps naturally, with the sales forecasts, projected to fall short of its specific clean tech goals that it set for itself directly or indirectly throughout the last years in the discussion around Fit for 55 and Repower EU. Here you see the LCP Delta projection relative to various political targets and numbers set in European Commission documents over the last years. So we are not on track for our clean technology goals. We estimate that 50 million boilers will be installed in Europe on this trajectory out until 2040, locking us into fossil fuel dependency and weakening our energy security in the years to come. The building sector is increasingly becoming a major liability for the EU's overall climate goals, and in so doing is also becoming a major liability for very high ETS2 prices in the coming years. And this graphic aims to represent that, showing in pink the difference between what member states project their emissions to be in the coming decades versus what a target compatible scenario would be from the European Commission modeling. In the short term, we are also seeing major stresses on the competitiveness of parts of the European heating industry that is invested heavily into heat pump technologies. During the energy crisis, 7 billion euros in investments and announcements were made into heat pump manufacturing. But with this market environment, those capacities are underutilized and increasingly putting those manufacturers under major in a very difficult financial and competitive situation. Equally worrying in the long run, we also believe that this slowdown could risk Europe's long-term competitiveness when it comes to clean technologies, including vis-a-vis foreign competitors. Now, on the one hand, and we're already seeing an uptick in the imports of clean technologies from China, and that includes both the actual appliances as well as an increased reliance on compressor technology, so components of the heat pump manufacturing in China. But also the long-term picture is worrying. We know from the automotive sector that China is very good at making use of its massive market and ability to have economies of scale to put itself in a very strong competitive position. And given its actual domestic heat pump targets, it is in a position to do just this in the coming years. So we believe that this stalling of the clean technology race in Europe could also forebode a similar fate for the European heating industry if there isn't a clear commitment to this transition in the coming years. So against that backdrop, we launched this project last year, looking forward to see if innovative policies could be brought in to correct this market environment given also the regulatory setbacks that we saw in the political debate over the last years. We were inspired in this conversation and this project by a very clear policy example, the UK Clean Heat Market Mechanism, an innovative new policy instrument that the UK is adopting this year, as well as, and naturally, interesting to the UK Clean Heat Market Mechanism, the EU standards for regulation, while controversial, has been very effective in driving of electric mobility. The project was accompanied by very extensive stakeholder consultation, both via conversations directly with manufacturers and associations during the research phase, but also through the development of a stakeholder sounding board, where numerous companies, civil society actors, and representatives of EU and national institutions were represented to discuss the potential role of such an instrument. And we were also supported by extensive supporting research by the specialized heating consultancy, LCP Delta, who you will also hear from in the next presentation. So with that, I'd like to hand over also to Stephen Ashurst, who is Head of Market Intelligence of LCP Delta, to dive a little bit deeper into what they see as the current market environment for heating technologies in Europe today. And we'll just need a couple of seconds to switch over to his Zoom presentation now. Thank you. Hi, Stephen. So we hear and see you. So if you unmute yourself, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Andreas. I hope you can hear me okay now. Sorry, I clicked the wrong button there. Thank you. Appreciate that. Oh yeah, good morning, everybody. As Andreas mentioned, my name is Stephen Ashurst. I'm Head of Market Intelligence, Residential Energy at LCP Delta. Sorry, I can't be with you in Brussels this morning, but my colleague and our project manager, our excellent project manager, Johnny Buzzing, is in the room in Brussels today as well. I am going to give you quite a brief and quick-fire overview of the state of play of the European heating market and weave in some background context as well. I gather that many in the room aren't necessarily involved with the heating sector on a daily basis. So with that, yeah, we should just move on. Start my timer to keep the time. Yeah, so LCP Delta, we're a specialist energy transition consultancy. We support our clients through subscription research and bespoke consultancy, as well as other services, technology and data services, for example. But yeah, we've been covering the heating sector in Europe for a long time, over about 20 years now, and yeah, supporting a wide range of clients and businesses who are active in the market. I would like to acknowledge all the excellent input we received from our clients and wider heating market contacts as we prepared this project. And of course, just to say it was fantastic working with our colleagues, mainly Andreas and Stefan at Agora too. With regards to the current state of play, so this is just a slightly different version of the chart that Andrea showed, just to, yeah, again, highlight how the main markets in Europe, we looked at 8 core ones for this project, are quite different in terms of the installed base of technologies that they have, but a commonality, as you can see, well, between the blue, the grey and the black bars, yeah, still a large share of fossil fuel, standalone fossil fuel boilers in the heating park, or just the installed base of devices. So sort of key points for that, yeah, the gas boilers are still #1. In some other countries, things like coal and oil are still widely used. Many million devices installed in people's homes. In less mature central heating markets, you'll still common to get room-based heating, whether it's stoves or electric panels as well. Heat networks, a key part of the decarbonisation solution, are invariably used, but often still have a small and in some cases declining share of the market. And air-based heating is, say air-to-air heat pumps, which there's a lot of interest and enthusiasm about, is still very uncommon, especially out of your Northern and Western European markets. Now, the one slide just giving an introduction to the types of companies and who are manufacturing these devices and in competition in the market. It's a very competitive market, mainly for those of you who, as I said, don't or aren't involved in the heating sector day in, day out. So we've got the incumbents, the traditional manufacturers of boilers, whether that's natural gas or oil. The sort of leading ones shown on the screen there, and they're characterised by still large volumes of boiler sales, although growing heat pumps as well, because they do have wide portfolios now, a global presence. Most usually, though, still Europe is the main market for them, and at group level their sales are into the several billions of euros a year. Then we have the companies who began life as air conditioning equipment manufacturers, and still that is still a significant, if not the largest proportion of their business, but they've adapted that technology to water-based heating and been in the European market for many of them well over a decade now. So their portfolio is quite different. You don't often see fossil fuel devices offered by these companies, rarely. For example, hybrid heat pumps, but often these are really the companies that are aiming to grow the heat pump market, and they also have revenues of billions and even into the tens of billions globally. And then another category is a sort of European specialists in heat pumps, in brands that you may have seen. So they're perhaps a little bit smaller in terms of scale and reach, but at least operating regionally. And these are also companies that are competing for the growing low carbon market. And then we have other devices, manufacturers of other devices, whether it's CHP, combined heat and power, or point source electric heating or storage heating, other novel technologies like absorption heat pumps. And again, the revenues of these companies, some of them can be quite small, but there's also many large international players in this group as well. So yeah, these are sort of the brands that you'll come across regularly in the context of the European heating market and decarbonisation. Now we're here to talk about policy, and up to this point, there's already been lots and lots of policy levers deployed by governments across Europe, UK included, Norway, Switzerland as well, including that, to try and accelerate the uptake of low carbon heating by consumers. So, well, you can see sort of 5 key themes of policy or incentive on the screen here. So we've got subsidies and rebates, directly addressing energy pricing, really, novel tariffs to reward use of low carbon devices, building regulations, both new buildings and existing, and yet more novel measures which are coming through as well, similar to the Clean Heat Market instrument that we're here to talk about. So yeah, just a quick run through of what has been seen. So yeah, direct subsidies or cashback offers when you scrap an older, less efficient technology and install a new one. Zero or reduced VAT rates on cleaner systems, and yeah, in some cases, and becoming increasingly common, is government-backed 0% loans, because invariably low carbon heating is more expensive than the incumbent options, at least on an installed cost basis. Some other countries are a little bit further forward with addressing the running cost and lowering the price of electricity relative to gas and oil. Denmark and the Netherlands are some key examples there, and we're seeing, before the enactment of the European ETS2, the carbon tax on fuels used for heating and transport across the European Union, other countries have already introduced that to their energy pricing. Denmark, France, Germany being key examples. getting a bit more, on the technology side, there's in some countries there's mandatory dynamic tariffs. So if you're using electricity, when it's cheaper on the grid, that obviously makes it much more beneficial to you to run a heat pump at that time, or preheat your hot water store for when it's needed later. And then more conventional things like feed-in tariffs or net metering, similar to what's been used for solar PV. Building regulations, essentially, just keeping an eye on the clock here, mandating what can and cannot be installed or replaced in homes, whether it's new buildings and you have to achieve a certain share of your heat from renewable sources, so thermal or indeed central heating devices, or when it comes to renovations in existing buildings, we're beginning to see a bit of activity there, but as Andreas touched upon, even where there is a strong government intent, as there was in Germany, it's a very, very politically difficult topic. Very, very few outright bans of boiler replacements, and where those do exist, it's only for oil. And then, yeah, we're seeing more novel things come through. So we're going to hear more about the UK example in a few moments. And then, yeah, the heat pump court is essentially an industry-led quality assurance scheme from Sweden, is always interesting to mention. You might say, well, if we have this issue of needing to accelerate the transition, why not just ban gas? You hear that a lot, but in reality, that's a very, very difficult thing a very politically difficult thing to push through, especially in countries where there's still natural gas heating is the predominant share of how people heat their homes. And I'm not here to say that a boiler ban is the way to go. This slide here just gives you an example of, there's a handful of countries where the conversation has become quite far down the line. But as it is, there's only a couple of markets where there's some restrictions on the replacement of natural gas boilers. And in the last year, there's been a few countries highlighted here, Ireland, UK, and the Netherlands, where there was more severe, if you would call it that, plans, but they've been reeled back, just given the broader context within the market, but the fact that many customers would be affected by this. And that's why, again, we continue to explore, well, what other political levers and measures could be introduced if it's to continue to regain the momentum, right, in the decarbonisation of heat. So where we begin is this is the outturn for the market last year in the 8 core countries that we really focused on for our work with Agora. Andreas mentioned that we're certainly coming down after the COVID pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine really led to a peak in the heating market. Not all these numbers are confirmed by the heating associations yet, but we're confident that we're very close. And I don't need to go through them one by one, but the challenges of high interest rates and it's a tough environment for consumer spending. Essentially, they're pervasive across all these markets, as well as political policy uncertainty as well. So that was the outcome for last year. At LCP Delta, we are slightly more optimistic looking ahead. So we believe 2025 is almost a reset year. The decline should cease in many of the core countries that we look at. And I should have sort of introduced the legend on the prior page there, but anything that's in blue is growing. The darker the shade, the more growth we expect. So, we expect this is the entire hydronic heating market, but we expect heat pumps to come with that. So yeah, France, Spain, Netherlands, single digits. Germany, looking for a stronger rebound in Germany this year across the entire market. Moving further east, Poland, Czechia, Romania, at least turning the corner back into growth in Italy as well. So that's what we believe will be the foundation for almost a reset in the market moving forward. So I'm going to finish my presentation just looking out to 2035, which is commonly the time horizon that we would look at. And this is again a similar chart to what Andreas showed in his presentation. What you can see up the vertical axis is the total deployment of units, again in these 8 core countries, annually, year by year. And the blue section is your standalone fossil fuel boilers. That's gas, oil, LPG, coal even. Orange is all your types of heat pumps, predominantly air to water, the most common type that people will be familiar with. Grey is air to air, so air conditioners used for heating, and then all else is the sliver of dark blue or black at the top. So our sort of business as usual view highlights looking out is that standalone fossil fuel boilers, that market is now in decline. We don't expect it will ever return to the levels it has seen in the past. I think peak boiler was 2021 as we look at it. And then by the end of the period, yeah, we're seeing 1 million less units annually sold across the boiler stock. Hydronic heat pumps, as I mentioned, the most common air to water, they've got a growth rate of 9%. So that's essentially returning to the growth rate across these countries as it was prior to the peak in the market during the pandemic period. I won't read out all these numbers, but you can see on the chart there a good increase in annual volumes too. Air to air, I referenced earlier, there's a lot of interest in this technology. It is cheaper equipment-wise than water-based heating, but there are also, it's uncommon. Where it is installed, it's predominantly in countries with large cooling loads. So yeah, there's still, there's of course innovation there, but we are perhaps slightly less optimistic of that really taking a share of the market. We've got a 3% growth rate over the period. This slide, just keep an eye on the clock. We probably don't need to go into it. It's just more detail per technology type, separating out the different boilers and the different types of heat pump. It's just more granular data based on what we've just seen on the slide before. So yeah, in terms of where we end up by the end of the period, the market is again larger. But by the time, 2035, we're still about 1 million units across the countries lower than we were at the peak of the pandemic. We've hopeful that the construction market will pick up again, but only at about 1 or 2% a year. So that's not going to be a major driver of growth. Growth really has to come from the replacement market. In terms of specific equipment, hybrid heat pumps, so a combination of a heat pump and a gas boiler, or indeed a heat pump and an oil boiler, but in our case, we expect much more growth for gas. Most relatively strongly growing equipment type at 15%. Natural gas condensing boilers, so they're down 3%. Overall boilers dropping at 4%. Gas boilers alone down 3%. The electric heat pumps only, compound growth rate at 8%. And air-to-air pumps, as I mentioned, 3%. This chart is looking at heat pumps only, all types, again, across the core countries, the 8 core countries, and you've got annual unit sales combined on the left-hand axis there. So you can see we get to about 2.7 million units in 2030 under our reference scenario conditions, considering the policies that are in place and we think that will come into place in these countries. So again, highlights should just chime with what we've seen on the previous screen. An absolute increase in almost 1.5 million units from the base year 24. France will remain the largest market. There will be challenge for that, like say Germany, but France is by volume deployment the largest. The Dutch market growing fastest. They've got quite a good set of policies in there that promote both fully electric and hybrid heat pump devices. The less mature sort of central heating markets, Romania, will still have the smallest volumes we expect, and then the least relative growth, Czechia, France, and Italy. So I think I've just about kept to the 15 minutes. A quick summary of the state of play and our outlook. So the market is in decline, coming off a trough at the end of a bumper few years during the pandemic, but a tough couple of years on the back end of it. At LCB Delta, we do expect a return to, we're at the moment, it's a return to pre-pandemic levels, but in the near future, as you've seen, we expect the growth in the market, and particularly with the low carbon devices to begin to pick up again to a similar order as it was before the pandemic. Lots of drivers in there, of course, the government subsidies, green-minded customers, innovation from the market. It's all important. More and more installers coming online, training in low carbon too. With that, that the growth rate that we're projecting, as Andrea said again, it's not at the level that the European Union needs to be on to get to the 55 goals and the ambitions for 2030. So yeah, novel instruments like clean heat market instruments should absolutely be further explored. And next we're going to hear, I think, about the UK market and have a closer look at the policy there. And my last slide is just, last year there was one country that that showed really good growth in heat pump deployment was the UK. This is more subsidy driven than novel policy driven yet. But yeah, that's my way of handing back to Andreas and colleagues in the room to move on to the next presentation. Thanks everyone for your attention.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for that great overview of the current state of the heating market. So yes, our next section will introduce, for those unfamiliar with the policy developments in the UK, the UK market mechanism. And instead of having a presentation, I thought it would be more engaging to have a conversation to explore and introduce this. We have a great set of discussants here to do so. This conversation was moderated by Young, who is director of the Buildings Program at the European Climate Foundation. So can I welcome her to the stage here today? Thank you. And Harry Bradwell, Head of Policy and Legislation Clean Heat at DESNZ, so the acronym in the UK, Department for Energy Security and Net Zero of the UK government, who has been very closely following the development of this instrument over the last year. So over to you, and I hand over these microphones for your conversation, and thank you so much.
So we're very interested to learn more about the UK Clean Heat Market Mechanism, which is very similar to the policy instrument discussed today. But before we do that, maybe you can say a few words of the UK sort of clean heat policy landscape before this was introduced.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, very similar to what Stephen was saying, kind of across the board. For sort of most of the 2010s, the UK government had a subsidy-led approach, essentially, to support clean heat. So we had something called the Renewable Heat Incentive, which was a tariff, a payback tariff. And then more latterly, that was replaced by a scheme we call the Boiler Upgrade Scheme, which is an upfront grant, which is quite a generous upfront grant at the moment. It's £7,500 towards an air source or ground source heat pump. And again, like lots of countries, we had sort of programs looking at the energy performance of buildings, but primarily that was about the worst performing buildings, and that wasn't really driving clean heat deployment particularly. And, you know, proposals to bring in regulations for new buildings so that increasingly standards would be set so that fossil fuel heating wouldn't be deployed in new buildings, and essentially heat pumps are expected to be the majority there. But I guess to step back from specific policy levers, we also had, I guess, a strategic context in the UK where gas heating predominates. So 85% of houses in the UK are on the gas grid and using gas boilers. And for a long time, the kind of public policy debate, such as there was really dominated by a conversation about, will the major future for heating in the UK be hydrogen through those same pipes, or will it be heat pumps? And to an extent, that debate and that sort of strategic uncertainty for market actors was perhaps leading to not a lot happening at all. And so those who were taking up the renewable heat incentive was a relatively, well, very small number of relatively niche early adopters of clean technologies. It wasn't anywhere near the kind of mainstream mass market that we might need. And so kind of about 5 years ago or so, when we started thinking about this policy instrument and others, the then government was looking to kind of move the conversation on from this getting stuck on hydrogen versus heat pumps to say, well, whatever the answer is on the future of the gas network, in any scenario, there needs to be a really chunky, sizable mainstream heat pump market. and that needs to happen fast over the course of the 2020s. So by 2030, a mainstream heat pumps need to be a mainstream choice that ordinary consumers are happily choosing. So what's then going to be the policy package that's needed alongside subsidy to get to a place that it can be an easy and natural choice for more consumers, even setting aside the question about whether you're talking about heat pumps in the vast majority of homes or just a really substantial minority.
And so would you say this was then the main reason for the UK to introduce this market mechanism? Or were there also other factors that led to its introduction?
It's a good question. I think there were a number of factors. I think certainly, so from that kind of point in time, one of the things the then government wanted to do was to say, as I say, there needs to be a large heat pump market come what may. And they set a ambitious target for that of 600,000 heat pumps as a market size for 2028. But just setting that number and saying that needs to happen wouldn't have been enough. What they needed to do was to marshal kind of investment in that direction and make sure that that was a credible pathway to that. And that's in part where the thinking that developed the clean heat market mechanism came in, which is saying alongside those, I guess, more traditional levers like subsidy and like, there were conversations always about, why not just ban gas boilers? Won't it happen then? The question was, what might be needed in the near term to give the market signals that this is something that the policy is serious about and that helps shape investment so that those actors, industry, businesses that are most able to transform the market have an investable policy framework to act against. And that's really what this is about. It's about giving about as clear a policy signal as you can to boardroom decision makers to say, this is the time to start thinking about all the different ways that your business can influence the supply chain to start to grow the heat pump market. Because all of the businesses we're talking about, the major manufacturers in the UK of fossil fuel boilers and gas boilers in particular, they're all parts of those same multinational groups that Stephen was talking about. They all make and sell plenty of heat pumps, particularly here on the continent. And the question was, and they were all perfectly comfortable with the idea that they would be selling plenty of heat pumps in the future in the UK. The question was, when exactly is the time to start making that transition? And how can they be sure that they're not going to move too early? As a company, that trying to be one of the earliest movers might not blow back in their face. And so this policy is as much about saying, well, everyone's facing the same incentive. And so those experiments, those investments in innovation about trying to find different ways to improve the consumer proposition for heat pumps in the UK, they won't be wasted because everyone needs to be pulling in the same direction. That's kind of really the genesis of this.
Very interesting. Perhaps before we go into more details of this, perhaps it's now time for those who are not so familiar with the mechanism. Could you maybe explain a little bit more on what is the UK clean heat market mechanism and what are sort of some of the design choices that were made in the process?
Yeah, absolutely. So in essence, it's a pretty simple policy. It's a pretty simple scheme. It launches on the 1st of April this year, and it introduces targets for the manufacturers of fossil fuel boilers, gas and oil boilers sold on the UK market for a proportion of those fossil fuel boiler sales that need to be met with heat pump sales. So for every time a heat pump in the UK is installed, a credit will be generated for the manufacturer of that heat pump. So if you're a manufacturer of both boilers and heat pumps, you can meet that target through just simply through the products of your own. So if you're selling enough heat pumps to meet the target, it's starting at 6% of boiler sales, then you'll earn enough credits and that will be the end of it. However, there is the option as well to acquire credits towards meeting that target from other heat pump manufacturers, either as an interim measure while you adjust your business, or perhaps for some companies that might be a longer term strategy. So any heat pump manufacturer acquires credits when their products are installed, and fossil fuel boiler manufacturers at the end of each year have to return credits that represent the number of heat pumps that have been sold. And that's it essentially. And the expectation is that that target will rise from that modest base in year one, steadily over time, so that there's a steadily ramping market that industry can invest against. But it's not in isolation, as I say. Kind of, this is one of many pieces of the policy package. So it's there alongside government subsidy, it's there alongside regulations in the new build sector and so on, so that together it's clear how this combination of policies makes, for that first year, that target very achievable. I mean, Stephen ended by saying that we saw 60% overall sales last year, 40% growth in the retrofit that the focuses on. And if next year saw a similar growth in retrofit installations, then it would be accompanied by the...
Very interesting. Perhaps I want to move back to what you said earlier, which is that, and I think it's the same situation in the EU market, that a lot of the boiler manufacturers also make heat pumps. And one of the key topics of debate here in the EU is also industrial competitiveness and competitiveness of clean energy technologies, with also the International Energy Agency saying that heat pumps can be sort of one of the few clean technologies of the future where Europe still has a chance to compete. Was this also one of the considerations for the UK to introduce this mechanism, because your heat pump sales have been traditionally quite low in the past?
Yeah, absolutely, in part. So, yeah, you're right. So, like many countries, the manufacturers that dominate the heating market at the moment in the UK, they are long-standing boiler manufacturers that over recent decades were acquired by European multinational appliance manufacturers. But a large share of the UK heating market is served by UK manufactured boilers at the moment. As you say, heat pump manufacturing and heat pump supply is relatively small in the UK. We have one large-scale heat pump manufacturer that's exporting to many other countries, and we have a handful of others that are just getting going or are more specialist. Governments, of any political colour in the UK are of course keen to see heat pump manufacturing in the UK grow, so that over time we're seeing good future-proof jobs in the manufacturer and all the parts of the supply chain supplying heat pumps as need to be. Now, where this policy comes in and others like it is again about investor confidence, really. So the firms, whether they are established in the UK market and already selling heat pumps or thinking about entering the UK market, are all making decisions about where to site their manufacturing plants. And while considerations about proximity to market and scale of market will always be in their mind, a package of policies that says that there will be a sizable heat pump market here to supply is going to be one of the things they're considering. So it's not directly kind of going to be driving manufacturing decisions in the UK. We have other policies, so we are providing financial support through an investment accelerator to firms to scale up heat pump production in the UK. And so again, it's that balance of things. There's direct subsidy support for manufacturers who want to scale up UK manufacturing. And then there's schemes like this that are saying, you can believe that there will be a market of scale to supply here. And if you want to be producing close to the consumer base, then that's a consideration to make. But, these are companies that probably won't be setting up factories in every single country. So it's always going to be an interesting policy challenge for governments to consider.
And maybe, I think quite some people here in the room may have seen some negative reports in the media. It's not something we are not familiar with in the EU, and quite some of the sort of bans on fossil boiler sales have been scrapped in several countries. But you succeeded with introducing this policy instrument, despite sometimes less positive media reports. Do you have some advice for policymakers here in the EU contemplating this instrument on what to do, what to avoid, based on your experience?
Yeah, the truth is there's always going to be that coverage of new policy proposals of this sort or any other really, and particularly when they're at the proposal stage, when things are kind of new ideas and still in discussion, there's always going to be a natural public policy debate, and some of that will be in rooms like this, and some of that will be through the press as well. And you know, I guess the things that we as officials can do is just make sure that that ministers and decision makers always have the facts at their hands, right, and can set things in context, because some of the narratives will sometimes be based on misunderstandings or kind of worst case scenarios. And actually, for ministers, it's about saying, well, here's how this is actually going to work, and here's how it sits alongside everything else, and why, in that wider context, this is a pretty normal and reasonable and pragmatic approach, and not something that kind of that people need to be scared of. I think that's part of it. And then the other part is just dialogue, as you'd expect. So you know, throughout the last 4 or 5 years of the development of this scheme, there's been regular dialogue between ministers, officials, and all parts of industry on the development and kind of the iterations of the development of the scheme along the way. None of that is rocket science, but obviously not kind of coming up with things in a closed room and then, you know, it comes out as a surprise at the end. It is part of the story. It's about making sure there are lots of channels of consultation and conversation along the way.
And of course, the wider context in which you also provide subsidies and support to make the switch.
Exactly. It's about saying that, you know, that wider policy framework isn't going to suddenly disappear overnight, which is an important part of the story here. We wouldn't be doing something like this if it was to exist in isolation. That wouldn't be a sensible policy approach.
So maybe a final question on how do you see sort of the future of UK clean heat policy evolving, and perhaps also this mechanism?
Yeah, so obviously, as everyone knows, we have still a relatively new government as of last year, and they committed to set out this year their warm homes plan. So essentially their strategy for decarbonising heat and buildings while maintaining affordability for consumers. And that will really kind of set the direction for the next few years across the full suite of policies. So I think it's much anticipated, I'm sure, in the sector. So that's the kind of the big near milestone. I think it's clear that this scheme will be a part of that framework going forward. And, you know, as ever for ministers, there's always going to be that choice to make periodically of whether this scheme stays exactly as introduced, or does it evolve as things in the market evolve? Are all of the choices that we're making for year one that perhaps are about simplicity and deliverability and making sure that this is something that, you know, that isn't adding too much complexity and all bells and whistles at the start? Are those choices still the right choices in 2, 3, 4 years' time? Or, you know, might market conditions or might the wider policy landscape suggest that, you know, there should be some tweaks to some of the parameters? So those are the sorts of things that will be in relatively constant review. And it's able to be pretty agile in that respect. It's not something that that is necessarily set in concrete for, you know, the next 10 years exactly how it works. So we'll see.
So the aim might still be, as we saw that this was scrapped in the UK, to perhaps phase out gas boiler sales by 2035?
So yeah, I mean, the previous government never legislated for a ban on boilers, and so there's nothing that's been overturned by the new government. But clearly it's ministers' objective to make it the natural and easy and affordable choice for every consumer to make the switch to clean heating at the time that's right for them.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for your time and for explaining the UK scheme. And I hand back to Andreas.
Thank you so much. And let's give a round of applause to the two discussants. And for those in the room, Harry will be around also after the event for further conversations if you want to ask him more about the experiences in the UK. But let's continue here in this debate, because now it's time for us to share some of our thoughts as to how such an instrument could be translated into the EU context and to what extent. And for that, I welcome onto the podium here Stefan Verheyen, who is Project Officer for Climate Neutral Buildings at Agora Energiewende, and he will be leading us through our next presentation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Harry and Frank. A very interesting discussion on the UK design. In the next slides, I'm going to walk you through our thoughts on how a similar EU policy could look. We called it an EU clean market instrument. And it presents key considerations for planning such a so key interaction with existing policy. So, first of all, to give you a brief discussion what this instrument would be, we suggested in three core pillars of this instrument. The first step would be a mandatory reporting mechanism for manufacturers to report all their sales of heating appliances. In the second step, then, each manufacturer would get a rating, a benchmark based on this reporting, clearly showing how far advanced they are in terms of transitioning their portfolio to clean appliances. And last but not least, in the third step, then, there would be a charge for manufacturers for selling fossil fuel boilers, and this charge would be coupled to the performance of the manufacturer. So these are the three steps which are also building on each other. And overall, these three steps sends an incentive to manufacturers to transition their portfolio. And for the overall effect, we can see now on the right how the instrument differs from traditional policy instruments. So traditionally, you have supply-side policy and demand-side policy instruments. For supply-side policy instruments, you have subsidies for manufacturers to expand their capacities. And on the demand-side policies, traditionally, you have grants to consumers to facilitate the access to clean heating appliances. So what's different with our instrument is that it doesn't directly send the incentive to the end consumer, but sends the incentive via the industry. So through the charge, you have an incentive for manufacturers to transition their portfolio, and therefore manufacturers will be incentivized to make clean appliances more accessible, more affordable, and therefore send this incentives on to consumers and installers, and therefore leverage their market power. This is the key difference between the traditional policy instrument and this clean heat market instrument. We think that there are three key benefits this policy would have. The first was already mentioned before. It activates market actors, in this case, manufacturers, to make clean heating more accessible. So as you have a charging system in this instrument, manufacturers would be incentivized to avoid these charges and to sell more clean heating appliances. And therefore, we envisage that there would be two ways they could react to this incentive. First of all, in the most simple version, they simply would decrease prices for clean appliances. And also, we think that manufacturers could get more active direct interaction with consumers. So they could make it easier for consumers to buy a heat pump, and therefore also strengthen the interaction with consumers and strengthen the accessibility of clean heating appliances. A second benefit we see from this instrument is that it could serve as a government commitment device. It could send a clear signal for governments to commit to the heating transition, to commit to the target of transitioning the heating market. So it would signal their dedication, and also the instrument could bind governments to produce further policies on strengthening the market framework for clean heating appliances. for example, through rebalancing energy prices to make clean heating more attractive. And last but not least, we see a very important benefit of this instrument in the interaction with the upcoming ETS2. We think that it would be a very well policy instrument which would very well complement the ETS2, because while the ETS2 will send a price signal for consumers on the heating fuel, so on gas or oil, this instrument sends a price signal on the appliance. So not only when people have already bought the heating appliances, but already when they're buying heating appliances, they will have this price signal sent through our instrument. So in that way, our instrument complements the ETS2. And also in the long run, the instrument would help to manage the price level of ETS2, as it will decrease the number of new fossil fuel boiler sales, and therefore also decrease the long-term demand for fossil heating fuels, so ETS2 certificates, and therefore decrease the long-term price in ETS2. Although, as you see, we are very, very convinced by our proposal, we're of course not blind to its limitation, and therefore we have used this phrase, I think, throughout the project. We do not see this instrument as a silver bullet, which can replace all other policies on heating decarbonization. We think that there are three key elements why this is not the case. First of all, as you will see later, it will take time to set up such an instrument, and therefore this instrument cannot address the delivery gap that will already exist in the coming years, as Andreas has shown before. And therefore instruments are needed to directly address clean heating in the coming years. Also, the instrument does not address all market barriers to clean heating. I already talked about energy price rebalancing, which is a key factor to making clean heating more attractive. This instrument does naturally not address energy prices at all, so complementary policies on energy prices are needed. Yes, and we think that a clean heat market instrument should be part of a balanced policy mix with rebalancing energy prices through the ETS2, but also the rebalancing of energy taxation in member states is a very important part of it. We also think that it's very necessary to provide targeted support for vulnerable households, which normally cannot afford clean heating appliances. And therefore, this is a very important factor for increasing the market share for clean appliances to provide targeted support for vulnerable households. And when looking at this balanced policy mix, one can see that the challenges for achieving the strong market framework for clean heating appliances, they're already urgent in the coming years, and policy action will be needed in the next years to achieve this. First and foremost, the proper implementation of both the ETS2 and the Social Climate Fund will be important to promote clean heating. For the ETS2, as already said, it will drastically increase or improve the electricity to gas price ratio, and therefore the economics of clean heating. For the Social Climate Fund, then it will provide revenues for which can be used for example, supporting low-income households when buying a clean heating appliances. So these two European measures are very, very important. But we also think that there are additional measures which member states can already take now for improving the policy framework for clean heating appliances, especially the rebalancing of taxation, both for heating appliances and heating fuel, in favor of clean heating appliances and in favor of electricity. These are already, as our analysis showed, already key factors for improving the economics of a heat pump and clean heating appliances. So, as I already said, we do not think our instrument is a silver bullet. And as you can see here on the right side of the chart, we think that there's a strong interaction between our proposal, the Clean Heat Market Instrument, and the overall policy framework. And that our instrument can deliver a certain part of the transition, but should not deliver the whole transition. And you can see this here on the right side. We have a scenario where the policy framework itself delivers a very small share of the transition, and therefore the instrument would be required to deliver a lot. So you would need a high incentive for manufacturers to achieve a certain outcome, and therefore the instrument would be a risk for the competitiveness of manufacturers and put a lot of burden on them. While in a scenario where you have a strong market framework, which already provides a good case for clean heating, you would have a more balanced incentive. And our instrument would deliver a certain share of the transition, but not too much, and therefore would be a digestible incentive for manufacturers. And yeah, this would be better for their competitiveness. A little bit on the timeline, as I already said, it's not going to be, such an instrument cannot be introduced overnight. You can see in the upper part of this chart a usual timeline for EU policymaking, keeping in mind an instrument produced before 2029, because it would 2 years for developing a proposal for negotiation between the institutions. So this is a long-term instrument, would provide a long-term signal to the industry. And yes, this is very important in terms of timing. And then last but not least, we of course have many additional considerations on how you could design such an instrument, which you can all find in our report, which we published today, as well as in the 2 reports by our consultants from LCP Delta, which have done a lot of work also on the UK system and on some policy learning from this. And with this, I give over to the panel, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefan. And with that, we are now coming to the final section of this event, where we will have a panel discussion to discuss the role that such an instrument could play and the broader market context. So for this, let me invite our great panel to the stage. We need to set up the chairs, don't we? Yeah, so sorry, 1 second. Let us just get the chairs here in order before I get them on the stage. So then I can start. So our first panelist is Martin Forsen, who is Manager for International Affairs at NIBE, which is one of Europe's leading manufacturers of heat pumps. He's been a strong advocate and proponent of heat pumps and clean heating as a technology over the last years, and has served also as the president in the past of the Swedish Heat Pump Association, as well as the European Heat Pump Association. Today, he is here representing us as a representative of NIBE. Thank you. Welcome to the stage. One second. And second, we have Giuseppe Lo Rubio, who is public and regulatory affairs director at the Son Group. It's a leading global manufacturer of heating technologies. And he also serves as, let me get this title right, president of Assotermica, the Italian association representing manufacturers of heating appliances in Italy. Today, he is representing our Stone Group, which is also traditionally a manufacturer, but I think he will set the record straight on where the company stands today. So welcome to the stage today. Next, we have Niels Ladefoget, who is Deputy Head of Unit of Buildings and Products at DG Energy in the European Commission. Niels has been instrumental in shaping EU policies over the last years on the decarbonization of the heating sector, in particular also the eco-design and energy labeling rules for heating appliances, but is also now in the thick of the new policy cycle. So welcome here today. And last but not least, I'm welcoming to the stage today Delia Villagrasa, who is director of the Cool Heating Coalition, which is a relatively new collaborative initiative dedicated to the decarbonization of the heating and cooling sector across the EU by 2040, and will also represent the perspective of various NGOs, think tanks, and associations committed to this cause. So thank you, and welcome to the stage. And the core question that I would like us to discuss today, before also directing more targeted questions to each of you, are do you share the sense of urgency conveyed in the report and the presentations that we presented today around the heating transition and the competitiveness of the industry? So is there a need to urgently act? And perhaps more specifically around an EU clean heat market instrument, do you think such an instrument specifically could contribute to guiding this heating transition? So let's keep those two questions in mind for the overall debate. But first, let me also ask questions, more specific questions to each of you. So Martin, there have been significant challenges on the heating market, especially for the clean heating market over the last year and a half. And perhaps in the case of your company, it was also symbolized by the decision by your company to lay off 340 employees in March 2024, or saw itself in a position to be required to do so. Now, about a year later, how do you view the current state of the heat pump sector? Is it as dire or as forward-looking as has been presented today?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think we need to start many years ago. The heat pump industry have seen a sustainable growth for more than 10 years. However, we would have liked it to be a stronger growth in the earlier days, but it was a sustainable growth. We could see it year after year, and we were quite happy seeing that development. And then we had the outburst of the Ukraine war, and we had the Repower EU report. We had the support from all the policymakers pretty much all over Europe, and a lot of support from the Commission. At that point in time, I stated in all my presentations to the general public, but also internally within our group, saying that we are over the tipping point now. The policymakers have decided this is the way forward. It will not go back. Because we saw all these straight, and the market just skyrocketed. And the Commission came to us, are you ready? Is the European heat pump industry ready? Can you pick up? Can you build up the capacity quickly enough? And the whole industry invested a lot in new factories. We employed a whole lot of new people. And we saw that skyrocketing energy prices. We had an energy price crisis, and all the citizens were rushing for heat pumps. At the same time, we had quite a bit of delivery problems with components. So we had huge orders, but we couldn't manufacture. But we were making ourselves ready. So we invested in new factories, employed a whole lot of people, and then we got some sort of over the component problem when we could start to deliver, and we just saw a great future. We were over the tipping point, we thought. But then all of a sudden, you know, all the energy prices came back to at least a little bit normal levels. And we could see that a lot of policymakers, they pressed the snooze button on the alarm clock. We can go back to sleep again. And some policymakers in some national member states, they got a little bit nervous about these discussions about that they had to change over very quickly. It's going to be tremendously expensive. Can we really do this? So they backed off. And that was the situation that we faced then a couple of years ago. So the demand dropped. We truly believe in the future, and we truly believe that we have at least a strong support from the European Commission that this is the way forward. The heating compass is still heading north. A couple of years ago, I said it was true and strong north, but now I see there still is a little bit of a nervousness around this. We cannot push as strongly as we did in the past, but I'm truly convinced it will come back. And we're not sure that we will come back on the high-speed track. The high-speed track is actually needed for us and for Europe to meet the targets. So it will come back. And I was quite happy to see Stephen's projections for the coming years, that we would see a normalized situations and that the markets will grow back slowly but steadily. That confirms our own belief that they will do. However, there will be differences in different countries. What sticks out, though, is I'm very happy with the UK government. It seems like the UK government so far, they stay firm. They believe in the plan. I believe that your compass heading is actually heading true heat pump north. And you're still staying firm, and you still have some belief. I truly believe it's going to be difficult to meet a target of 6,000 heat annually by 2028, because you're far off from that. I'm entirely sure that the heat market mechanism is the best choice, the ambition of it, and whether this will work in Europe. I'm not entirely sure it will work. I'm not entirely sure whether the heat pump industry in Europe is very happy about it. We have seen, I mean, what we would like to see, there has to be eventually a stop for the sales of boilers altogether. But it seems like no one really dares to open that discussion, because it will be tough. And even within the heat pump industry is not fully convinced that that is a good idea, because what we saw, especially in Germany, when there was this discussion about the introduction of a boiler ban, it was that quite a few people were rushing off to get their boiler while they still could. So it could actually boost the sales of boilers the years before a boiler ban. I'm not sure, but it has to eventually come somehow. So I have a good vision for the future, but the trick is, how can we get back to the high-speed track? And that we need to work on. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. So here we have a first perspective as to in which direction the policy framework is pointing and how strong that signal is today. Giuseppe, maybe over to you to provide a complementary perspective. So Ariston has traditionally at least been very strong in boiler manufacturing and boiler sales, but it is transitioning to heat pumps. Can you tell us a little bit about that transition, but perhaps also some of the hurdles that you're facing in making that shift?
Thank you, Andreas. And first of all, I'm very happy actually to be here and to have worked with you in the stakeholder board. So thank you to you and Stefan in particular, because I think we might not see eye to eye on the solution. I'll come to that, but I do believe it is necessary to engage. So first of all, since you wanted that from when you introduced me, let me set the record straight, as you said. Ariston, I guess it's an interesting case. We were born as an electric company, electricity-based company. Ariston, actually, wherever you go in the world, you will find our electric storage water heaters. So we come from electricity. Then, of course, I mean, we moved into gas heating as well, because that's what we do. I mean, we do what customers want, right? And that is also why we moved into heat pumps, because we started to see there was a great interest by customers to get heat pumps. And being very strong in water heating, our starting point was the heat pump water heater, so the dedicated hot water heat pump. But today, Ariston is, as you mentioned, a multi-technology player, transitioning. We do have like 3 manufacturing sites in Europe, actually in the 3 biggest countries, in Germany, in France, and in Italy. So we believe that the heating transition is necessary. We believe heat pumps are a key component to it. So we're very focused on now make that happen. But now, on the instrument and what we need, I think, actually, I always like to start with an analogy. I myself come from the power sector, and I was lucky enough to actually be in the power sector when the renewable revolution started in there. And the instrument that was chosen at the very beginning, not a lot of people remember that, was the green certificate. And the clean heat market mechanism actually is a lot like the green certificate scheme. And that's where it worries me, because, electricity is electricity no matter what, right? I mean, like you turn the switch and it goes on and off. And honestly, customers do care about green electricity, but at the end of the day, it doesn't change where it comes from to the end point, right? It's electricity, it's electrons. If you want to apply the same logic to heating, I get very nervous, because there is the client at the end of the line, as I call them, we say in Italian, Signora Maria, nobody understands me, so I say Frau Ursula, and you see what I mean here. So it's the archetypal customer. And what worries me is that, I mean, if you need to feed a heat pump, there will be disruptions. There will be, pieces of equipment, furnitures to be moved here and there in the house, because maybe there isn't space. There is the outdoor question still open. There is the cost, which is very relevant. There is the operational cost, which is very relevant. So I think just by bluntly taking, let me say, the example of the green certificate and moving that to the heating sector doesn't necessarily work. And therefore, we are very skeptical about a clean heat market instrument like this one, whether it will work or not. And by the way, also the reporting, I didn't think about that until Stefan mentioned that before. But I mean, like, honestly, all the research we have seen, not even the energy label actually moves customers to choose one technology over the other. Maybe Niels has a different opinion here, but like what we have seen from analysis of customer behavior is that they don't really care. So, I mean, like, you can label us as, I don't know, Z tier because we sell all boilers, which is not the case, by the way, but you can do that. I don't think it's going to change the perception of Ariston towards our customers, which, by the way, are the installers and not the final customers, because they will recommend still the Ariston boiler or heat pump to their customers. So it's a tricky one. But now on the solutions, I think, I mean, it's the usual playbook. I'm not going to say anything revolutionary here, but I do believe it is necessary to state it nevertheless. And that is, we need incentives. And by the way, when we mention incentives, the politicians become very nervous. We don't ask for incentives forever, maybe because, I mean, I come from the power sector. I've seen the shift, and I think we need to go down the same path. Incentives need to be reduced over time. Otherwise, I mean, it's not going to work from a public spending point of view. So that's a very important component. Give the signal right away, push it, and then maybe stick to it. Just don't do like Italy and France have done very recently, or Germany as well, changing stuff, I mean, and confusing consumers. Second is the operational side of things. Electricity costs a lot of money, and in particular in some countries like mine. And that's where actually I do have a very strong view, maybe because of my past. I mean, like, we do need something that we should take inspiration from the UK, I guess, is involve utilities a lot more. No utilities offers a very good dedicated heat pump tariff outside of the UK, as far as I know. They are coming up in some countries, not everywhere. That's most definitely what we need to do, work with them to make this happen. But at the same time, a lot of these utilities, they control the distribution grid company as well. And that's the elephant in the room that nobody speaks about, and where I'm very vocal on. There is going to be a massive investment required on the distribution side. And guess who pays for that? The end customer at the end of the day. There are calls for what they call anticipatory investments in grids, right? That means, just to put it in a very blunt way, that today's heat pump customers will pay for tomorrow's investment in the grid. And maybe we don't know whether actually that investment is fully needed. Because today, with my model, with my projection, I say, I need that. Maybe that demand doesn't turn up. I've put infrastructure in place that is not needed. So I'm making people pay today for an investment of tomorrow. I know this is going to put me at odds with utilities, but I think we need to have an honest conversation, as we have had in the stakeholder group in general, on this specific point, because I sense that's going to be a very big roadblock. And finally, by the way, you mentioned that, guys, very much, and I agree, ETS2 is key. We would like to see ETS2 succeed. We need to be very conscious that it is a very tricky instrument when it comes to the politics around it, as is the rebalancing of taxes and levies. One point I'm very keen on is, and I know a lot of people want to move levies from electricity to gas. I think if you do that, you're in for a social unrest, upheaval like the Gilets jaunes, because there will be situations where customers are going to find very hard to actually switch to another technology. And therefore, you're going to make them pay for something that they cannot benefit from. And that's unfair. So we need to establish fairness. Electricity pays carbon taxes. Gas, oil need to pay carbon taxes. But we need to be very careful on the social dynamics around this. Sorry, I've been too long.
Thank you. So you've laid out a whole set of measures that would need to be put in place for us to really accelerate this transition. I think you've made clear, without us having the detailed conversation yet, there's some skepticism as to this instrument being at the center of that transition. Let's now move on to our next participant, Niels, who you are now one of the voices helping to shape a new policy agenda. We know parts of what that could be. I mean, it's been part of the policy political of the president, mission letter. Now, partially, we know be a clean industrial. We know be an electrification action plan. Next to other things that planning. To what extent does an instrument like this fit into the current political moment? And is it aligned with the goals that are at the center of the political debate in this European Commission or not?
Thank you. Let me start by thanking you for the invitation and for the very interesting analysis in the report and on the market situation. I think we look very closely at that, and I think it's very helpful regardless of whether we'll see this instrument or not in action. Let me start by saying I think we should recall that there's a lot of policy on the books now, and a lot of policies that's not even, let's say, entered into application yet. We have in the unit I'm in charge of right now, the brand new EPBD directive with a lot of new rules on buildings that needs to be put into action in the member states. But already as of this year, 1st of January, the directive requires there are no more financial incentives for standalone boilers powered by fossil fuels. This, if you like, this is could be said is a basic thing that should have been done long ago, but thankfully we have now that on the law books. And just this week, by way of example, Belgium, where we are sitting now here, just announced, the new government announced the end of reduced VAT for fossil fuel boilers. And by the way, also announced they will apply reduced VAT rates for the next 5 years to heat pumps. Something that's explicitly provided for in the VAT directive that was negotiated a few years ago during this past mandate. So that's a shift that's already possible with the existing shift on the treatment of the upfront costs, tax treatment. We also have clarified in the EPD the legal basis. Member states can ban boilers if they wish to. That was not so clear in the past, and that's certainly been clarified beyond doubt now. There is also an obligation for member states to make best efforts to phase out standalone boilers powered by fossil fuels in existing buildings in line with the national phase-out plans for fossil fuel boilers. So there is, they have to make best efforts to do this. There's not a kind of clear-cut ban on technology, but there's a clear direction and a clear policy signal, I would say. Then there's, of course, planning obligations to take policies and measures with a view to phasing out boilers. And there's a zero-emission buildings that effectively ban fossil fuels from heating in new buildings as of 2030. And we have binding renewables target as well in the renewables directive. We have energy efficiency directive, new version with a lot of requirements, including local planning requirements. And we have, of course, also, again, in my little garden from the NRB3 perspective, we have in a pipeline revised eco-design and labeling requirements on the way. We hope to publish them in a matter of 2 months to publish the drafts. As Giuseppe, I think, rightly said, right now the label doesn't really play a lot of practical difference. I think we have the ambitions to change that. because right now the label is not really seen, it's not really used. And let's face it, boilers are A-labeled. So, you know, if you actually see the rating, people will think that's going to change. And we believe the label can play a role in this. So we haven't given up on that. We are also looking into labeling radiators, low emission, low temperature emitters, to help people select radiators that actually fit well with heat pumps or condensing boilers. And the EPC requirements under the new EPBD actually say that EPCs in the future should give buyers, purchasers of flats and buildings information on the, let's say, low temperature readiness. So there's a lot in the books, and I would prefer focusing on putting that into practice and using the opportunities rather than putting another layer on top. I think that's not going to give as urgent changes as using the opportunity we have already now. Ultimately, there's a question of political willingness and a nervous, of course, about the impacts on workers, on normal people. I just learned that it's for industrial employment here. It's jobs and in the clean industrial deal and a just transition and so on, and keeping manufacturing businesses in Europe. That's what we're hearing outside the windows here. So it's and the reality, and this is you will have heard, some of you will have heard me saying this before as well. The proposition that the heat pump industry has so far managed to give consumers isn't always that convincing. It's terribly expensive still in many markets to buy a heat pump. It's terribly complicated and cumbersome. And if the industry doesn't kind of up its game there in terms of delivering a hassle-free customer journey, it's going to be very difficult to get everybody along. So I think there's also some inward looking to do there for the industry, and you know, the people outside this building, they're worried about the jobs. It's a dilemma for me, because we need a lot of people with their hands and brains well connected that perhaps were manufacturing diesel cars before, but could well be good at installing heat pumps. We need those people. So I think there are room for policies to kind of better link this transition up and make them less nervous about it. And I think what we saw in Germany, in the debate in Germany, clearly shows that if you want to move too quickly or with too kind of radical measures, then and you kind of scare some people away, and don't convince everybody, then it risks being a big backlash. But I'm optimistic. I think the fundamentals are really good for the heat pump industry. I think we will see growth in the coming years. I've seen a change in attitude also with from companies like Ariston and the big dual product manufacturers. So I'm quite confident we will get there. Thank you.
Thank you. So I take this intervention as one to really point to what has been achieved and fought for in the last Commission should be the main focus of our policy discussion in the coming years, or at least it should be the starting point. And that these policies could make an additional dent in what is a very large gap. I would point to the fact that the LCB Delta projection takes into account changes like that already. So given that, Delia, how do you assess the EU's current heating and cooling policy framework? I mean, we've heard today, maybe we should focus on what we have today. The industry, on the other hand, has said, okay, it's nowhere near enough, but okay, maybe we're both pointing at member states now and not the EU level. Do you think the current EU policy framework is strong enough to deliver the 2030 and 2040 climate targets and other energy goals?
Thank you, Andreas. I mean, if I would want to keep my intervention super short, the answer would be no. but I will be not that short. I believe Niels is right. We have totally to implement what we have to the maximum, and actually we have to over-implement it. The mandatory aspects of the current Green Deal legislation are not enough. So everything which is optional also has to be implemented if you're even going to be halfway on track. And we did an analysis last year. We commissioned a study from the Öko Institute to assess how far the Green Deal legislation brings us to a full decarbonization of the heating and cooling sector by 2040 and by 2050. And the rather shocking result was that even assuming the best possible implementation of Green Deal legislation, we are not going to make it, either by 2040 or by 2050. Basically, if we look at the Renewable Energy Directive, which mandates a minimum increase of renewable heating and cooling percentage points per year, we realized that we will reach decarbonization by 2050. That percentage point part have to be increased from 1.1 to 3.4 percentage point increase of renewables. If we want to decarbonize the sector by 2040, we would have to look at an almost six-fold increase. That shows you basically the gap we are facing currently in decarbonizing the sector. So we have to implement what we have, but we need additional signals, we need additional instruments to achieve this full decarbonization, which is absolutely essential if the EU wants to reach climate targets. The very first things I think the Commission should be doing is sending the very clear signal that we're staying the course, that we will have new mandatory renewable energy targets for 2040, mandatory efficiency targets by 2040, that the EPBD will be improved, so that it's very clear for the market, okay, that's the way we're going, that's what we're going to do. We're going to invest further in heat pumps, in solar heating, in the geothermal, in the other kind of clean technologies we have. But that market signal needs to stay. And what some of you certainly have heard, for instance, the potential future Chancellor of Germany, Mr. Merz, said, well, he's going to overturn the existing German heating law. Not the smartest move in my mind, but well, there you go. So we need that policy certainty, and we need to make sure that what we have is improved upon, and that industry has a clear signal as to when it will be improved upon. Additional new measures could also be very welcome. And here I see potential for something like your market instrument. If it's done well, it could be an interesting addition. It cannot replace what we have, but it could be an addition to what we already have as complementary instrument to accelerate the transition. Leave it at that.
Thank you. And maybe now to return to the beginning of our panel again. So Martin, you've now heard some of the additional comments about where we stand and the framework that would be needed for the heating market to succeed from different perspectives. Was there anything you thought was missing from that picture? Or is there anything you think would be particularly important to highlight? But then it would be good to get some maybe high-level thoughts as to can such an instrument help provide that framework for investment and certainty?
Yeah, so thank you. I think Niels said a lot of wise words here, and we truly believe in most of what you said, Niels. I think a lot of measures are in place. However, if I'm to pinpoint what is still missing a little bit, I think we have a bright future for new construction. That's not the problem. And already, if we look at the building codes existing in Europe today already, with the older version of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, we have a very high share of heat pumps in new construction. So we are relying on the building codes for new construction. But there are some pieces missing in for going for the retrofits. And as you know, that's the biggest stock of the buildings, those are the existing buildings. We need measures that really make this change. And what we haven't discussed here so far, what I truly believe is the most important driver is to fix the energy price ratios between electricity and the competing fossil fuels. That is what we can, if we can level that out somehow, addressing taxes and levies so that the polluter has to pay. There will be something coming with ETS too, but the current carbon price is way too low to have a major impact on that. I don't see that that will tremendously change. So we need to address the taxes and levies further to get that properly fixed, because then consumers can trust and rely on steady prices, not skyrocketing, and they will actually make savings. So that's for the long-term economy of the investment. Then we have to overcome the first cost. And there we have a tremendous work to do in some of the European countries, because Niels, again, is truly right. We have a lot of work to do in the heat pump industry. The customer journey is a challenge in several countries, not to mention Belgium and Brussels specifically. It's a nightmare. But even in our biggest market in Europe, in France, if you would like to go for a ground source heat pump, it's a challenge because you can't find a driller and then you need to find an installer. There is a waiting time in some areas for 6 months to do it. And who can wait? If your boiler is broken, you need to get it fixed tomorrow. So then you need to offer the possibility for people to plan their change. That's crucial. If you are to shift from an existing technology to a new one, you have to plan for it. So here's where the subsidies come into my thought. The subsidies have two strengths. First, it helps overcoming the first investment, but it also helps people to start thinking, planning for making a shift. You know, most households are quite busy in daily life. The life puzzle is challenging, and they just expect the boiler to work in the basement. They don't care about it. And you can be quite sure it breaks down in January or February when you're having all your relatives over for the weekend. You panic. That's not the time for you to look out, oh, maybe I should go for a heat pump. Let's look for some offers. There's no time for it. You have to make a quick shift, and then there will be a new boiler in place. That's how most people think. If there is a subsidy in place, you have the possibility to make it possible for people to plan their shift, because it's in the back of their head. There is a subsidy in place. Maybe I should consider to do this shift. They can plan it and do it over time. But the subsidies mustn't be too generous. If they are too generous and there is not enough competition on the market between the installers grab quite a bit of that subsidy. And that is the only reason I can see why in some member states, and also, well, Switzerland, but you know, Switzerland is always a high price market for everything. But anyway, it's more than 5 times as expensive as it is in Sweden to install a ground source heat pump. And Sweden is not the cheapest country in Europe. How can that be? It's because this is the market. It is strong competition in all the stages in the value chain. There it works. We didn't see the prices skyrocketing when there was a subsidy in place for heat pumps in Sweden. So we have a lot of work to do ourselves, but to pinpoint then one thing, again, what most important is to fix the energy price ratios. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll just note what wasn't said again was introduce a clean heat market instrument, but we'll talk about that hopefully still a little bit. But over to you. I will ask the question to you, and I won't let you off the hook here. How would you see a clean heat market instrument shaping your market environment? And where do you think that it would fall short or make a difference?
Thank you, Andreas. First of all, maybe because I'm Italian, I need to support what Martin has said about overly generous incentives. As you know, we have had one, and companies have profited from that. I guess there is nothing wrong with that, but the instrument was wrong, and now the pendulum, as you know, swings, and we are all the way to the other side. The government just decided to cut the subsidies for heat pumps, by the way, 50%, which seems a lot, but an Italian family to get a heat pump needs to actually foot the bill up front, and then in 10 yearly installment, you get that 50%. You understand it's not the way forward. So in Italy, there was a long debate about let's scrap subsidies for boilers, which were still in place. But, as usual, we focused on the tree and we missed the forest. And now I'm very worried about what's going to happen with the incentive scheme. So we need to be very careful. But otherwise, I agree very much with what Martin has said. I think was my point here. On Andreas, and the blunt, and I'll give you, I don't think, Mark, this one what we need at all. Niels has mentioned very forcefully that there's a lot of innovation to be. By the way, let's not forget, maybe because I'm a nerd here, but I don't want to nerd out, but there is a lot of regulations which are impacting our sector, which will come our way, which is not going to make heat pumps cheaper. Is the critical raw materials regulation, for instance, is the CBAM, another big elephant in the room. So, we need to be very careful there. But I mean, there is a lot of good stuff which needs to be implemented. And I think policies need really now to focus on, delivering this change. But then, I mean, I'm very happy as well to be kept on the hook by Niels when he says industry needs to deliver. Of course, I mean, I think, well, maybe I shouldn't put it this bluntly, but I think Ariston is one of the top of the leaders in the water heating market in the world because we are good at doing what we do, right? In terms of our footprint, installation, et cetera, et cetera. So, of course, there is a big lesson to us as a manufacturer, but I guess to the community of manufacturers to say, you really need to get your act together and work to the benefit of customers. We're all looking for the holy grail solution that when the boiler breaks down, we go in with a heat pump and put it in. Maybe someone is very close, someone else not. But what I'm trying to say is that there is actually innovation in this market. We are seeing a bit of innovation. And our worry is that the more the regulations or the instruments you pile on us, the worse actually is going to be. And the most difficult is going to be to comply, and the least effective is that going to be. So that's why I'm still not convinced that given the current situation with the market and with the regulation that we have, we need this extra layer. I think Niels used this word, right? Or this analogy, we don't need an extra layer of regulation here. And I stand by that because I don't think it is needed. All that is needed are the other parts. By the way, speaking of companies, then I'll shut up, I swear, Andreas. But one of the points, for instance, is installers. And Martin made that point very forcefully as well. Just to give you an example, I mean, not to boast about what we do because everybody does, but I mean, we as Ariston are opening academies around Europe. We have started from Germany, our biggest market, by the way, where we have a very strong heat pump brand there. And there is this academy which, is meant to actually train the installers. The workforce of tomorrow is about upskilling them, is about reskilling them, is about really making sure that there is an alignment between the supply and the demand of these competencies, because when the market picks up again, which is going to happen, I don't know whether it's 2025, as Stephen mentioned, but it is going to happen, of course. We need to be, ready to go, because we've been caught off guard, maybe in 2022, 2023. There were bottlenecks, as Martin mentioned, also on the side of installers. This time around, I think we as a sector are trying to, plan ahead and, be sure to have the workforce as well as the components and the manufacturing capacity, et cetera. So I think, there's so much on the plate that this thing here is not going to be helpful. I would be very interested, and then I really close to see, Harry, whether if you scrap the boiler upgrade scheme and move in full force with the clean heat market mechanism, whether the astonishing growth that we have seen remains, my take is going to fall off a cliff because the incentive is actually doing the heavy lifting here. And it's quite a good mechanism, by the way, in its working, not just the money, because the money is usually like, oh, it's a lot of money. It's not just the money. Like I explained about Italy, is about the way it works and the way it makes customers to change their minds. So I would love to, to have a little bet on that one with you.
Thank you very much. So yeah, I mean, I think a clear message, at least when it comes to the instrument, some skepticism comes from the question, is it going to lead to additional regulatory burden, essentially? Does it just complicate, weigh down a company rather than enabling them, sending them a clear policy signal? On the other hand, we did have the perspective from another manufacturer saying there's not enough competition in the market. And we had the perspective on the one hand to say, okay, no, we are within our existing market framework, we are competing. And I think the common thread still of the conversation is it doesn't add up to meeting our climate goals, doesn't add up to meeting our energy goals, and it doesn't necessarily put our European industry in a competitive position. And in that context, Dele, you said essentially we can look into this instrument. That being said, NGOs, some of your members are often very concerned about the social impacts of clean heating policy. So in this context, what are your concerns, or if you are optimistic about it making a contribution in the positive direction, either way, how do you view a clean heat market instrument in that context of the need to balance social justice needs?
Thank you. It's, I think, a very important question, and I'm happy to have read in your report that it's something you also were looking at. We have at the moment about 10% of EU citizens living in energy poverty. We had 47 million people in 2023 which could not heat their homes adequately. And that's up from 30.8 million just 2 years before. So we're really looking at a very important issue across the European Union, which is why our members are quite concerned about it. Heating is the biggest energy cost in the residential sector. About 80% of your housing cost, energy cost, is heating. Decarbonizing heating and cooling can help address energy poverty because people are no longer dependent on volatile and high fossil fuel prices. And those prices, I don't think they're going to go down, neither with the Russians, nor with Trump, nor with anybody. So frankly, I think those costs are going to go up. So we need to decarbonize also to address energy poverty. That's very clear. And if the instrument is done well, it might actually help achieving that. The big question clearly is, will it bring down the cost, particularly for heat pumps? And here I can see there's two aspects, the economy of scale, which could come in and drive down costs. Heat pumps aren't rocket science, so I don't really understand where that expensive. But I hear it's also partially installers. So one recommendation would also have to be your training installers now. That's one step, but how do you keep them from actually just ratcheting up costs unnecessarily? So there need to be some incentives to make sure, and that come on top, I think, of the instrument, that there are enough subsidies for people before they install the heat pump, not just at some point afterwards, that they can do that and be done through different pricing mechanisms. So that would have to be, I think, additional. Several people have already mentioned the gas to electricity price ratio. That's a huge running cost issue. I think EB's analysis showed that in Brussels, well, in Belgium, you're never going to be having a heat pump in any way that is economically affordable because the electricity prices just are ridiculously high. It's not the case for all EU member states, but for Belgium, for instance, most of us live at the moment. That's really an issue. A third issue, I think, is the customer journey. My colleague, Claire Taylor, has written a very nice LinkedIn blog on how tough it is if you want to get a heat pump. So making sure that is simple, because at the moment, my gas boiler breaks, the installer comes in, looks at it and says, well, madam, I can put you another one in tomorrow. If I want to do a heat pump, I have to assess how well insulated is my house, are the neighbors near or far enough away so I can have the heat pump outside, etc., etc., etc. It's quite complicated. And people don't like complicated and they don't like change. So make it simple. So all these things, I think directly the mechanism can't address, but it needs those measures to actually accelerate the change. And I think these need to be there to make the transition affordable for people, to make it simple for people. Heat pump targets, as outlined in the Repower EU what was it, the communication, I think, can help achieve cheaper prices. The target for heat pumps for 2030, for instance, would cut household heating prices by 20% by 2030, that's it. So that by itself already is a good step forward. But again, if done right. So I think those are some of the barriers we're looking at. Reduced VAT rates, etc., can help with that. I firmly believe we need to get to some type of mandated phase out of gas boilers, and politicians just have to bite that bullet. I mean, we have a lot of cowards around, they don't dare to do so, but we need to get that signal too, to make sure that the heat pump take and technology happens fast. So I think it all affordable for the average citizen, it easy for the average citizen. We need the instruments we now have accompanied by the financial, in particular, the manufacturers and the installers to be better on board and not to hike prices because of mandates, for instance. And we need to make sure we have a long-term vision for people, not just for the people who are house owners, but also for those who rent houses out. Well, that's also house owners, but for those who then rent, because that's a really big market and we're not talking about that. And they're talking, for instance, with social housing officials, which many communities have, could be a really important measure to ensure they start installing clean solutions, which would then make those who rent the apartments have lower bills. So we have a whole set of a holistic approach which we need to ensure the transition happens in an equitable and fair manner, I think.
Thank you. So before opening up to questions from the audience, just a quick rapid fire section, and feel free to very briefly even reiterate things you've already said, but I think it's a good practice just to nail down some of this conversation. So I'm going to ask each of you, what is the single most important change needed to accelerate the heating transition in Europe? Be very, very brief. Some of you have already made strong statements. So starting with you, Martin.
Energy price ratios.
Niels?
Business models in the heating industry. Delivery. Hassle-free, low-cost delivery.
Delia?
Political will. Make it happen.
Giuseppe?
Stable and predictable incentive schemes, like
Okay.
the BUS.
Thank you. So very clear statements. And a second very quick round. You have all read the paper or been involved in one form or another in the project. If you could change one thing, now this is not endorsing this instrument any way, but if this instrument were to come and you could change one thing about the instrument as we have currently proposed it, what would it be? And I'll start in the reverse order. Giuseppe.
So you really want to put me on the spot. You know, I want to change so many things that I'm unable to pick one. I think, you know, can I do it slightly differently? I'll say one thing which doesn't work, in my opinion, in the UK mechanism, and which is not necessarily in yours, very quickly, and then that's the trading of certificates. Because if you oblige someone to do something, and then this person, you know, bears a financial consequence, and there is somebody else, a pure heat pump player that has no obligation and everything to win from the trading of certificates, that's a recipe for industrial disaster. You necessarily do not want it that direction, I understand, but that is very concerning from a competitiveness standpoint.
And similar concerns have been raised about CO2 standards and the pooling mechanism there as well. Delia.
probably two things. How could we create the instrument in a manner which also helps other clean tech? At the moment, it's focusing on heat pumps, but we also have solar heating, geothermal, district heating. Could it be kind of shaped so that it helps with all the really clean technologies? That would be one, and adding the social component in some way. I don't know how, but adding that component. So that would be the two things, not just one.
Thank you very much. Niels?
Yeah, as I said, I'm not so convinced this is what we need, but if it was voluntary and a pure reward, so that member states would use social climate fund money, for instance, to reward the top runners that rate well and perform well, that could be perhaps motivate some of the big manufacturers and become disruptors in this field themselves rather than being disrupted.
So flip the scheme, and I mean, mainly the pricing element of the scheme, which is also the heart of the proposal that we make. And finally, Martin.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm a little bit skeptical against the fines here, and like you have you have alternatives for the different steps here, but your first proposal was to mainly count the number of units placed on the market with small differentiations. I find that very blunt, and with these fines in place, there is a huge risk that there will be a race to the bottom, so that today players that are manufacturing and selling boilers will go to ISH next month and go to the Chinese corner there and look for the cheapest heat pumps that they can find and buy them and just dump them on the market at the lowest price just to fulfill their quota and avoid the fines. That will create disruption, which is not good for the industry. It will probably generate bad repute and not building up the high quality in installations and in products. So I'm a little bit nervous about that, so that I would skip that.
So be very careful in design. That's something we talk about in LCB Delta's report around white labeling as a concern. Now, with that, thank you so much for those first thoughts, and we will now go over to questions from the audience. Let me maybe begin with online. Stefan, let me look over to you. Were there any questions you wanted to take from the online participants? Yes. Not yet. Okay. So now open to the audience in the room. We have some time to now be closing this discussion. So we have two questions, four questions here. I'll take all of them, and then we'll take the answers from the panel, please.
Yes. Good morning.
Please state your name and affiliation for the audience online and in the room.
So I'm Valérie Séjourné, the Managing Director of Solar Heat Europe, the Solar Thermal Industry Association. This sector, solar thermal, is an EU-made technology, one of the renewable heat supplies. And as Delia said, we would very much appreciate that our technology is also part of the solutions which are actively promoted. We are committed to the Fit for 55 implementation. There is indeed a good framework to, roll out our technologies, but we also see that some of the political attention is a bit focused on single solutions, when we are a no-regret solution which can work for those households who cannot yet afford the full decarbonization panel, which can help decarbonize part of the gas supplies. If you use a gas boiler, it can also help put less pressure on the grid if you then use solar thermal with a heat pump. So please don't omit EU-made technologies like solar heat as part of those EU-made solutions which can already help address at least part of the problem, notably with domestic hot water, which is 15% of our needs.
I'll take that more as a statement, but well noted. Oliver, over here.
Good morning, everyone. Oliver Young from GCP Europe. So I'm representing the European Plumbers and HVAC Installers Association. I wanted to make a comment because in the final statements made by all panelists, although the issue of installers had been evoked in the statements, it was not really made clear in the final statement. And actually, I think that what this project here is offering, as well as a lot of things that have are being offered by the EU, are interesting measures, but they're not addressing the core issue. Because as was mentioned, at the end of the day, manufacturers sell their product to installers. They are the one who need to be incentivized. Installers, the majority of the installers are not in-house, let's say, are not in-house companies directly influenced by manufacturers. They are a third party. That third party is, let's say, not enough kept in the discussion in Brussels and member states. The incentives are given to the end user, but the end user is not making the final choice. He's not making the final choice on its own, on her own. They're deciding it together with the installers. And so the issue of the price, the same as you may with an architect or with an internal designer, decide that you might opt for a more expensive solution because it better meets your needs. Same is also with the discussion you have with the installer. So the installer at the end of the day is going to be the one who is going to decide whether or not a solution is going to be installed. There are a lot of solutions that do exist already. Why are they not installed? There are some good framework market conditions. Why are we still having the problems that we have? So could be a silver bullet really to look at the incentive of the installer rather than for the manufacturer or the end user. If the installer has a financial incentive to offer the best possible solution, he or she would do everything they can in order to offer the best possible solution. Maybe a heat, maybe some at the best possible cost, because there will be competition also, and competition will be playing fair and at the right level. I'm happy to hear comments on that and to collaborate with whomever wants to. Thank you.
So again, I'll interpret it as a comment, as you've pointed out. Hugo over here.
Thank you, Andreas, and thank you very much for your presentation, and thanks to Stefan as well. I think it's great that that people like you are suggesting and putting ideas in the debate, and I think that's great. I have two questions, one for the industry and one for the Commission. We discussed about several policy levers to fix what's not working in the current market. We talked about bans that didn't work, and I hear that we talked about the solution of rebalancing energy prices. And on both this issue, I think we should not forget that the industry, the heating industry, had an impact on that, had an influence on that, and that's the heating industry was in a coalition with the gas industry, and we should not forget the impact of the gas industry. We didn't really talk about it today, but it's a bit the elephant in the room. The gas industry is pushing against the transition of the clean heat market, and the long-term interest of the heating industry is not the same as the gas industry, and these ties between both should be broken. And the heating industry has, of course, its own issues and has this transition to be made. But yeah, so my question is, when do you plan to break the ties and to make it clear that you are committed to the transition? And my second question is to European Commission. You said that we should implement the PBD, and that's great. I'm 100% agree with that, that we should implement the eco-design and also the renewable energy directive. And that's the whole framework is sufficient. I tend to disagree. The whole framework was sufficient in its first proposal, but right now we don't have the eco-design percentage. We don't have all the PBD that was planned, and we don't know about the implementation. And so my question is how, and you also mentioned incentives. Actually, the incentives that is in the PBD, it was long before planned to ban incentives in the energy labeling regulation. So there was a lack of enforcement. The Commission didn't enforce its own rules on member states. And so member states didn't enforce these rules. And so my question is, how do you plan to enforce the rules right now on the 2040 targets? How do you plan to enforce the rules on the minimum share of renewable energy in the Renewable Energy Directive? On the article where it says that when you install a new heating system in a building, there should be a minimum share of renewable energy. How do you plan to enforce it? And I'm wishing you good luck, because that will not be easy.
Thank you. And then the last question from Claude Turmes in the back.
Thank you. So I was some years legislator in Europe, and then I had the opportunity to be a minister in a small country. This country or this government threw a lot of money to the heat pump industry. In this country, it's impossible to build any gas in new buildings. So the problem is really the existing market. And I would rather agree with the gentleman who mentioned the political force of the installers. My nightmare as a minister was the installers. And I think giving money, targeted money to installers, that's probably the one thing which I would at least test. And then my question goes to Giuseppe, and I put the same questions in these days to Rockwool, to Vestas, not to Vestas, to Rockwool, to Velux, and so on. For me, our big challenge is renovations, the existing buildings. These installers, it's 1 man, 2 man, 2.5 people. They have very little education often, very reactionary to new things. So I think beneath giving money to installers, why does Ariston not create a company where it invests on the spot into heat pumps? So to be a service company, and maybe, so the one thing I could see in the housing strategy, the day when Velux, Rockwool, and Ariston co-organize a company and then go to 3 or 4 targeted markets. Big guys, well organized, with real good social conditions also, because that's the other problem, that these installers are not well paid, the people who are today in this business. Good, and then maybe a final remark to Delia. Energy poverty is a trap. Have you ever heard anybody speaking about smartphone poverty, which is a real problem? Has anybody heard to speak about car use poverty, airplane or air flight poverty? So what has happened? We have 35, 40 years of neoliberal politics who have created poverty full stop. And I'm pretty sure you ask Eurostat to give you a statistic all over Europe. Price of kilowatts of electricity, gas, and oil compared to the purchasing power or hourly income you have when you work. Energy was never cheaper than today. I repeat, energy was never cheaper than today. So the problem is the ratio between electricity and oil and gas. And we need to stop to speak about energy poverty. We have to speak about poverty and unequal distribution of the wealth in our societies. Because otherwise, we are trapped. Climate policies now have also to solve, and I think Timmermans was very instrumental in that, to solve the social crisis. And come on, solving the climate problem is already a big task. Yeah?
So thank you. I think for strong statements and several questions, one recurring one around why not do more with regards to incentivizing installers. I will hand over to you. You've heard the comments and the questions. We have about 10 minutes left. And so I will let you react in these last 10 minutes. And you both had your fingers up at around the same time. I will do it in this sequence, Martin, and then Giuseppe, and then we'll have final reactions here as well.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Oliver. A very, very good point. We mustn't forget about the installers, and not only talking about the installers in a negative way, but also talking about the importance of installers. If we could give some kind of, incentives for the installers in helping out making the shift, that would do a tremendous lot of work. I think that would be very, very useful. And I don't have the silver bullet answer to how to do it, but that's something really to consider if we could incentivize the installers to promote this kind of shift somehow. And talking about installers, we're also talking about a lack of installers. What I would like to give as an advice to policymakers when they're designing their grants and subsidy schemes for heat pumps, it could be a good thing to do to introduce the subsidies in levels. There has in place several countries you can reach a certain level of subsidies when you're building certain requirements. I think it could also be that we could give a higher incentive to those customers that are a deal with a contractor who has some kind of an apprentice program in place, so that they are actually taking part in making sure to upgrade skills and bringing new people into that segment of the industry. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you, Giuseppe.
Thank you. There's a lot actually to cover, but I'll try and do that. Solar heating, we love it. So of course, we are trying to, we do not put all our eggs in one basket. So solar heating is part of that. On the question of breaking free from gas, if I understand you correctly, Ugo, I guess that's for me. I don't think actually that we have a problem of that kind of a type. Actually, I would say that the gas industry is not necessarily helping us in the transition because, for instance, in Italy, we are asking constantly, what is the prospect of biomethane also for heating? I know there are different views here, or also on hydrogen, there are super different views, but let's say we don't have an answer from that. So I'm not sure they are so instrumental to our case. And actually, I am a lot more worried with the electricity industry, maybe because I come from there. And I'll give you a very specific point. Dynamic tariffs in Italy. The big electricity retailers in Italy will sell you a dynamic contract with a spread of 35 euros per megawatt hour. Is that gonna make any dynamic contract interesting for a client with a heat pumps? Not at all. I mean, 35 euros is like roughly half the price that you find on the wholesale market. It's not gonna work. So I think we have a problem with the electricity industry and not with the gas industry, to be very fair. On the last point, on installers' business models, thank you, Claude, for the suggestion. Actually, I like to be on your side for once, because when I used to work for Euroelectric, you were the scourge of Euroelectric, so you didn't like us a lot. But at the time, of course, at the time. I look young, but I'm old, so it was a long time ago. But jokes apart, I think a new business model is a very interesting proposition. I cannot possibly comment on commercial business. By the way, maybe a lot of you do not know, but NIBE and Ariston are the only companies which are public listed company in our sector. None of the other are actually public listed companies, so you will understand a bit of caution also on our side to comment on commercial things. What I can say from a policy standpoint or from an advocacy standpoint is indeed, it is important to work on new business models, and there is a lot of activities going on from all sides, also when it comes to incorporate installers in your network. So I think how do I put this? Stay tuned for the future, not just from Ariston, but from the sector, because you hit a very important spot right there. And that brings me to installer. I do not add anything more than what Martin says, so I only say I agree with Martin with what he said.
Daly, over to you to respond to anything you want to address.
It's not easy, but maybe on the energy poverty versus poverty point, I obviously agree with you, Claude, that overall it is poverty tout court, which limits people's access to clean solutions. And indeed, climate policy cannot solve the social issues which we currently face in Europe and elsewhere. But it has at least to be mindful of those people who cannot buy the transition as easily as some of the others. And policy, I think, is well served to address those issues so that we avoid the backlash against green policy, which we are unfairly already seeing, because the current energy crisis obviously is a fossil energy crisis and not a renewable energy crisis, because it's fossil prices which have driven up the cost for everybody, but people don't see that. And the fossil energy companies are very good at pointing the finger at any subsidy the renewables get to claim it's their fault, which is rubbish. And we know that, but the average Joe or Jill on the street doesn't. So I think it's important that we accompany climate policy with good social policy to help accelerate the transition without further pushback. And I see the pushback happening as we speak in the European Parliament, which tries to weaken down the EPBD, which is not even yet implemented. Countries which speak about not wanting to do the ETS2, etc., etc. So it is important to keep people on board, to leave nobody behind in the transition. And I think that's a really particularly important aspect with the heating transition, because everybody has some type of heating system at home. I've never been asked about what I'm doing in my job as much as since I'm doing this coalition. Because everybody has an opinion. Whether it's informed, that's another question, but they all have opinions. So I think particularly for this sector to be very mindful of social aspects and how to make sure that people can relatively easily do the transition, afford the transition, and benefit from it at the best, in the best possible outcome. That's really quite crucial. And I think we could do that if policymakers had a bit of gumption and would put the cost where it should be on fossils and help the clean side, which we still do have budgets for, because there's, if I look at the few fossil fuel subsidies, it's huge. Let's reorient those to clean, and we've solved half of the problem. So that's perfectly feasible, but we need to have it done. So that would be my kind of take on this.
Thank you so much. And finally to Nielsen, there are 2 points that I've noted. I'd love for you to respond to. The one is the enforcement question that came from Hugo. How do you plan to enforce the things that are on the books today to drive change? And secondly, you made a point about business models. If you have any comments based on some of the things that were said today.
Thank you. Yes, on enforcement, I mean, that's the Commission was very clear in the competitive compass that enforcement and market surveillance is going to be a priority for this next mandate. And we will, of course, also look at that, I think, prioritizing where it's most important and starting with trying to help make sure we get good compliance in the first place. For the EPBD, we're doing that by preparing a very comprehensive package of guidance documents for member states to help them get good implementation in a timely fashion and an effective and pragmatic, practical implementation. On eco-design and labeling, we're doing a lot to try to help proactively retailers and manufacturers, importers comply with the applicable legislation. So helping, I think a lot of the time actually there is willingness to comply, but we have to admit sometimes the rules are too complicated or people are not aware. So proactively help raise awareness and help people comply and help member states put in place the transposition where that's required. I'd like my second point to be on the oil and gas link with the oil. I think it was an excellent question. It was to Giuseppe, but I would like to perhaps comment on that because, you know, I think a good part of the people that were out here listening to music and speeches were probably fired people from the car manufacturing plant here in Forêt. And I think it's very instructive to look at what has happened in the car industry. And I think the heating industry would better pay a lot of attention to that because there's no doubt the oil industry has been very active in trashing electric vehicles as the future solution. Incumbent, the fossil fuel car industry had, of course, an incentive to do that, but we see that it was not a very long-lasting solution. And I think the upside of this transition is that essentially what we're talking about is a large-scale replacement of expenditure, ongoing expenditure of fossil fuels, imported fossil fuels, replacing that expenditure with expenditure on European jobs and European manufacturing potentially. So there's actually something in it for everybody, manufacturers and installers. The cake can actually grow, but somebody will lose, and it's those that produce and sell fossil fuels. But if we need to get around to that, and I think there the business model comes back. Let me give you an example. I changed some windows 2 years ago in my house, and I found a company that came out. They have a brilliant website. You ask for a quote. They called me the same day. Came people who had equipment to measure old glass. They could exactly the K value. They were experts in the glass. They could tell me how I would save. 2 days, I had two different offers. And when I finally, and this was changing the glass, not the frames. Okay, but they come and check that you can do that. The frames are good enough. And a few days, once they were installed, in a few hours they were installed. No disruption, clean up. This was not your little local SME. This was a flat glass manufacturer who had seen that there was a niche. They had actually tried to ask for the vitrier. Were they interested in this kind of? They were not. And roughly in parallel, I changed another glass where we did change the windows. The customer journey was just awful compared to, you know, the level of expertise of the guys who came in was just not comparable. And so my point is here, there is a big opportunity for the manufacturers to take charge of that customer journey. And even with that business model, there is still need for the installers. There's still need for the people. Actually, they could perhaps get more to do. They could have nicer jobs with less administrative hassle because you can divide the labor. So my big point here is productivity gains in installing and replacing heating installation is the big prize. And actually, the ones that will pay is the ones that sell the fossil fuels today. Voilà.
Thank you very much. We've run just over time, so let me just say a few last words to wrap up this conversation. So what I heard today was that the picture we pointed as to the state of the heating industry is largely confirmed in the sense that heat pump sales are largely on the trajectory that LCP Delta has pointed towards. Gradual growth from a trough now in the last year, but will gradually pick up. And at the same time, there are not yet sufficient answers to close the gaps to our energy goals, our climate goals, and potentially our industry is at risk in the short term if things don't improve. And in the long term, if we don't have if industry doesn't properly commit to a transition to clean heating. But we had different views as to what the solution are to that, and perhaps even with what urgency we should be addressing those solutions. So I think we've opened a debate We've tried today to put one proposal on the table. I think generally there's still reservations from industry, from the European Commission about the political moment, whether there's appetite, and there were various arguments brought as to that. We have presented in our report in LCP Delta's analysis today some of our thoughts about that. Many of them were shared by you, I think, today around, for example, the need for a broader policy framework. We underline many of the points you've made today as to the broader framework that is needed. We've also heard about some other ideas around, for example, installers being incentivized, which is not the core of our framework. That could be part of the debate. So other policy solutions, other concerns around, for example, electricity grid investments. Are they going to become another bottleneck and other things that have to be addressed that go beyond the scope of our paper today? But hopefully we've today kicked off a conversation about, on the one hand, the need for action and the urgency of action. On the other hand, some debate on one particular policy proposal. And thank you to everyone today, especially those who've had to travel today, Martin, Giuseppe, and Harry from other countries. Thank you so much for taking the time and for joining our conversation.